was Jesse in the Bible? Jesse in the Bible is father of David, and thus an important part of the lineage of Christ, the son of David. Matthew chapter 22, verse 42. We don't know much about Jesse as a person. Most of the Bible's references to Jesse come in the context of his relation to his famous son David. In order to understand the rich history surrounding the name of Jesse, one might begin by tracing his lineage back to Abraham. God chose Abraham and promised that through his seed all the nations of the world would be blessed. Genesis chapter 22, verse 16 to 18. Jumping forward several generations, we are introduced to Boaz, a wealthy and God-fearing resident of Bethlehem. Boaz demonstrates God's redemptive character by wedding himself to Ruth, the Moabitess, who forsook her ungodly heritage. See Numbers chapter 25, verse 1 to 5, and clung to the God of Israel. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. The book of Ruth is an incredible story of God's salvific nature. By faith, Ruth is welcomed into the fellowship of God's covenant people, Israel, after her marriage to Boaz. Ruth gives birth to Obed, Ruth chapter 4, verse 13, and the Bethlehemite women rejoice in the blessing of God over her family. Verse 14 to 15. Boaz and Ruth's son Obed later begets Jesse, who becomes the father of David. Verse 22. God's choice for king of Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. Thus Ruth was granted a place of honor as the great-grandmother of David, who was a type of and faithful predecessor to the Christ King. Jesse takes the stage with his eighth son in 1 Samuel 16 to 17. The prophet Samuel invites Jesse and his family to a sacrificial feast, but Jesse only brings his 7 oldest sons, including Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema. All 7 were rejected by God as king. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 6 to 10. Jesse had chosen to leave David, his youngest son, to tend the sheep. However, it is this lowly shepherd boy whom, to the probable surprise of both Jesse and Samuel, God directs Samuel to anoint as the chosen king. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 11 to 13. Although it is David's kingship that typifies and anticipates the reign of the Christ King, Jesse's name still receives mention in a couple prophecies of the Messiah. In Isaiah, Jesse is mentioned as the stump from which a branch, Christ, would come forth to be a banner for all peoples. To this banner all nations would rally. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1 to 3 and 10. Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5. Furthermore, Micah chapter 5, verse 2 identifies Bethlehem, the little town of Jesse, as the source of the King of all kings. The branch from the root of Jesse would eventually spring forth and bear everlasting fruit. The New Testament begins with these words. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. From God's promise to Abraham and all the way to God's promised Messiah, our vision of God's universal program of salvation expands as new narratives bring fuller color and understanding. Jesus' genealogy in Matthew references not only Israelites, but also Gentiles, including Rahab, the God-fearing mother of Boaz, and former prostitute of Jericho. Joshua chapter 2, verse 1 to 21, and Ruth the Moabitess, grandmother of Jesse. From this mix, Jew and Gentile clan, Christ came to be the banner not just for the people of Israel, but for peoples of all nations. Romans chapter 15, verse 7 to 13. Jesus was not the beginning of a message of salvation for all, but the climatic expression and extension of the salvation God had already extended to all who believe. Who is Jess? Although a relatively minor character in the biblical drama, Jess shares in a rich lineage essential to God's plan for redemption for all nations. May Jess' name be to you a symbol of a grander narrative, a blessed lineage, a beacon of hope for all who choose to call upon the name of the Lord, young and old, Jew and Gentile, slave and free.